Good morning if you're in Los Angeles, and good afternoon if you're in New York, and good evening if you're in Great Britain. The purpose of this podcast is to become a voice for the single mom, the gal who's working and trying to raise a child or two, and you realize that it doesn't work out and it's not going to work out. She makes so much money by the time she pays rent and comes across with uh, uh, clothing and healthcare. There's she has to make far more money than she does. It doesn't work out. It's just not going to work out. And to go to have a solution to go back to home economics. Remind everybody that in the 1950s, the communists came out and said they would overthrow the United States by about the year 1973. And in the early 70s was when there was a profound change in our society. Here in the United States, we went from home economics to individual rights, and you could just see everything change. It was terrific for that one group, that generation, and they became what's called the consumption society. And then you had to work more and more hours. And now that adjustment's been made, and you're in dire straits, and you just have to speak up before anybody can go any farther, you're going to have to hear this. You're going to have to chime in, and you're going to have to start saying things such as, okay, this is how much money I make. This is how much it costs if I went and got into a house, a 3-bedroom brick house and a half-acre lot, something that gets you out of poverty. This is how much I have for clothes. This is how much I have for recreation for yourself. And boy, that's a dream now, isn't it? There was a time uh, in the year 1973, if I get the records right, was the highest standard of living for the average Joe in the United States, it, not by coincidence. And it was very easy for a guy who was a repairman to marry a gal and raise 2.2 children and afford a 3-bedroom brick house on a half-acre lot. The standard of living was so high for the average Joe that people got themselves killed to try and get in here. That's what made the United States a magical place to live. They threw all that out. And now you're paying the price. You have to do something. The idea is to push our economy until it collapses, and they do an awfully good job of it. Home economics, may I remind myself, before we go any farther, there's a YouTube channel called The Priest and the Pimp, and another one called The Priest and the Pimp Media Access. We're going to try and put the two together. And then there's there's going to be a YouTube group. There's a Time to Act on Facebook, and Time to Act on Instagram. And we're going to gather our gang together. Once you do that, then you can do something about it. You have to do it yourself. I mean, it has to come from you. Home economics is when the married couple is viewed as a base economic unit. Uh, Go up to the computer you're listening to this on, pretend to take out a transistor. You take out a second transistor, and as you take out the third transistor, it's no longer a computer, it's a pile of electronic parts. Put that transistor back in, it's back to being a computer, and there you go. That's the family unit. It's the opposite of poverty. There's poverty, and it pulls you out into home economics. 10-year-olds can't pay for their mommies. Mommies can't take care of the kid and go out to the repair shop, and dads can't work at the repair shop and come home and take care of everything. It's physically impossible. It just doesn't work out. And you're feeling the effects of that, so much so that you're being plunged in poverty and all the other circumstances that go with it. Let's go back to home economics. There's poverty, and the opposite of poverty, getting people into a world of plenty, is called home economics. That's how you get a detached house in the post-World War II United States. It's defined that way. So you get a living room. You have a living room, and then you have a bedroom to sleep in, and a bathroom, a dining room to eat in, and a kitchen to service, and a utility room to keep things going, and a backyard, a garage. You had a family car, and that family car it was considered a lot like a farm truck, and It might have had a front yard, and that detached house put you in a world of plenty. You felt out of poverty and into plenty. As a comparison, draw a line out to the side, please. That's as opposed to communist housing projects, and as opposed to slumlords, to apartments. You notice how no matter where you go, whether it's Chicago or Philadelphia or in the former Iron Curtain, Russia and Czechoslovakia and those countries, and every place else in the world, uh, everybody hates living in housing projects. And you wonder why. It's because they're designed to cram as many people in there as they possibly could. I knew somebody who was an architect type, and he told me that he could very easily design a house where the young couple would live happily ever after, or he could design a house where the young couple would be divorced in 6 months. And it's the latter that make up housing projects. They also make up apartments. And then you realize that the people who build those housing projects and the people who build those apartments are the same group. If I have a sense of category, then I realize they're the slumlords and the communist intelligentsia are the same group, and housing projects and apartments are the same group. They form a kind of V, and it's called the lazy V. You can start by the early 70s, and you could see it. You can see the V on its side, and it goes like this. And that now you're down here in a world of poverty, just like all the other societies in this country. And there's a smaller and smaller group up here, and they don't have any problems with it. There's also emotion, by the way. There are parameters of competition. And if you, in the 1970s, there was a solid connection, a welded connection between money and malice. They got into all the gold and they got into all the real estate. They also were malicious about it. They made money by causing people to have to work more hours. And so the most vicious people rose to the top. And it goes into a world of God and country. But the long and short of it is that if there is no God, if Christ didn't rise on the third day, that stuff actually means something. Then the highest standard of living you can have is to be a psychopathic nut. Living in the foothills, you do all the consuming, and everybody's in the valley doing all the producing. And that's what we've come back to now. And so you've just got to start speaking up. If you'll start chiming in or finding people and chiming in and putting numbers to this and start complaining, then you can do something about it. Otherwise, you can't. Without sounding too, however it's going to sound, it has to be a government of the people. You have to speak up first before you do anything about it. In philosophy, there are three things that make up God and country. Straightening up your emotions, and there's a sense of original sin. Both the Catholic and the atheist define mental illness as the normal taken into the abnormal, from a cold to the flu to pneumonia. And the Catholics say, hold on here, go backwards. Go back to being normal, and the normal is normal but not good enough. For example, if you're a young man sitting in a chair and he fantasizes about the gals until he becomes sexually aroused, then he pauses, he looks around the room, does it again, only this time he's trying to actually get the gal pregnant. And there you go. Those thoughts, those very strong, powerful thoughts that fly through his head that have to do with sex, have to do with getting the gal pregnant, and that's not a natural thing or original sin. The same is true with fear and hunger and those things, and the same is true with your environment, and it's a learned thing. So that famous phrase, what takes away your free will? Fear, sex, ignorance, and violence is part of it. In other words, you have to straighten up your emotions. It's a very unnatural thing, and to straighten up your emotions. And you can just see a Democrat and a Republican on one side and a Democrat and a Republican on the other side of an issue. Or two Democrats on one side and two Republicans. And if you have a sense of category, and get the Democrat who's trying hard to put you in your own business, and the Republican is trying to do the same thing, and they'll shake and shiver and they want to attack you, even though in reality, if you push it, you realize they're on the same side. And it has to do with original sin. It's just not a natural thing. You have to learn that. And willing the good of another person, willing the good of another person, taking the leadership quality of washing the feet of the apostles, a phrase from E.W. Tan, turns into something called a normal supply and demand curve. And that's just where you get it. And God and country actually means something. Willing the good of the other person, straightening up your emotions, you do that because Christ rose on the third day. And that's psychological. There's an attitude. Find a priest, and you realize there's a distinct attitude and difference. And that involves an emotion, and that involves chemistry in his head, and that involves the atoms and the electrons in his atoms. And they'll talk about trying to tune into something out there, some infusion out there, some computer electrons out there, and that they'll hold as faith. That's what you hold as faith. If you hold that as faith, then you start to be normal and well-adjusted. You start to have the families of base economic, and you head out from there. You're actually normal and well-adjusted. Being normal is a religious thing. In case you didn't know it, a normal supply and demand curve, that sort of thing. And so there are three things that make up God and country: straightening up your emotions, willing the good of another person, and doing it because Christ rose on the third day. It's a religious thing. And that was the staple that made up the United States. And they were trying so hard. And they were doing an awfully good job of it. We were a pillar. Our standard of living is so far higher than anybody else in the world, especially after the post-World War II period. And that includes Europe, and that includes the Soviet countries, which are supposed to be the prima donna intellectuals position. Just so it said, going back to philosophy, without saying we invented anything or any of these other sayings, they'll say a human being has two natures. And here we'll say a human being has three natures. There's a chimpanzee side of us, and we act very determined, and we do the things that we do. And then there's that second nature, a very much a learned thing, the Catholic nature, and that being normal and well-adjusted and that sort of thing. And that goes against one goes against the other. Sex is just so easy to see that you'll see that with a snap of a finger. And so you feel as if you're trying to make the grade, and in a way you are, but remember, baseball players, the very best of them, only bat about 300, and that's about as good as human beings are going to get. And so you have to be told that too, and you just laugh and have fun of it and get on, and all these good things happen because of it. If you adopt a God and country attitude, Christ, Catholicism, if you adopt that, and then a yank appears, and these things happen because of it. It's a choice. And then there's the third nature. Third nature is the complete absence of those three arguments, and that's some people call that evil. If you hold absolutes, you take it out the extreme, it's evil. So they call themselves a class of intelligentsia. You realize communism is nothing more than that. Find an old Catholic Baltimore Catechism, take out a piece of paper, and during the commercials of TV sometimes, simply write down its literal opposite. You'll not only know what an intellectual is, or the intelligentsia, you'll know how to manipulate and intimidate people. They're diabolical. They split everything apart. They don't lie. They just don't tell the truth. It goes on and on. And so in our shop, and so very deliberately doing that is what we'll consider the bad guys, the priest and the pimp. The priest says, excuse me, there's a priest over here, and he says, say what you mean what you say. Everything else comes from the evil one. Then there's a line, and there's a flip-flop. And there are two lines that come out here. One is very natural, going from the normal to the abnormal, and the other is the routine of a pimp. And the pimp knows how to manipulate and intimidate people. He has his own rules and he's very good at it. And that's far and away the norm of society now, especially today. You don't realize it until it's too late, I guess, but go back to the 1970s, and right when society was changing, courts in the United States came out and said, we decided there will be no more religion in government, period. That was a profound change, and they snuck it in. That was one of those Twilight Zone moments where they did it and got away with it without us in the pews, realizing what was going on. They actually adopted the stereotypical, straight out of the books, definition of a satanic church, the complete absence of those three arguments. What does it mean? It means they institutionalized pulling a bum's rush. And there was a cashing in on everything. They scrambled to get into all the gold and all the real estate they possibly could. They wouldn't think twice about getting into a duplex and renting property out to you. And they quickly turned into a peasant and property class society with them as the upper class. They had reached a fork in the roads, and they chose to cash in on it all. They didn't have to. It was their decision, and it was strictly their decision. And those decisions always involve emotion. And so the more of a scoundrel you were, the better off you were. They could have gone the other way. And reaching that fork in the road in the 1970s, they could have said very rationally, there is no God, therefore I'm going to start renting out property. I'm going to go up in the foothills. I'm going to put the factories overseas. It was something I learned from school. Excuse me. It's a story, but we'll give them a piece of paper called $1. They'll give us a stereo. And so we'll, in a sense, own it. And that works fine for about a generation. And then my kids will collapse and starve and die. Society will collapse, but I don't care because I'll be gone. And believe it or not, if I say it that way, it sounds ruthless. But go back and listen to them, and they'll put emotional demeanor of social justice on that. They could have gone the other way. They could have said, okay, we reached a fork in the road. And instead of saying there is no God, we'll say Christ rose on the third day. The guys in the Supreme Court will look, walk, talk, and act like a Catholic priest or a canon lawyer, whether or not some guy died or came back from the dead or not. And since that doesn't seem to work, we'll just act like they're Catholic priests. And there's an open research lab in the physics department right down the hall. Go figure out what's going on, come back, tell the rest of us. That will accept as faith. If you accept that as faith, then you turn around and then you start saying all B or C, all A or B, all A or C. You start acting rationally, very intentionally, and decent, as intentionally as you can. And so if you want to be a good citizen in this world, you have to be normal and well-adjusted, and you have to put effort into it. And that's what makes you a citizen as opposed to somebody else. And then you have home economics, and you get the benefits. You get to live in the house. We get the benefits of moms who are well-adjusted and trained. There was a time in this country when motherhood was viewed as a very fundamental profession, and fatherhood. And then it turns into home economics. And that's the magical stuff that makes our place such a decent place to live. Being normal and well-adjusted, being, if you choose a good husband and wife, if you choose that as a profession, then motherhood is a profession. And then it turns into home economics. I get to sneak something in here. When our father passed on, our mom was having a rather hard time of it. The gal up the road, they both moved into this neighborhood, the house you see behind me. In 1950 or a little before that, a little after that, that neighborhood, this is when this neighborhood was built. And so the gal came down the road, grabbed her, and says, "You're coming with me, come to our church." our mom, who was a British gal, she came over after World War II from Great Britain. This gal was a black gal who went to what used to be considered still the flagship Black Baptist Church. And so there's my mom going into with all these gals who were 99.9% black gals. And then there she is dressed up as a stereotypical British gal. And they didn't think twice about it. They were having a blast. They ran a soup kitchen there, and I ran down and was happy to volunteer there. Just so it said, I volunteered to help the volunteers. It's incredibly difficult to run a soup kitchen, and those gals did a professional job of it. There's a catch there to all that, isn't there? Those gals weren't Black Baptists. They didn't know it. They were the last of the 1950s American home economists. They were the ones who knew what they were doing. They were the ones who placed sex inside of that sense of becoming a mother, inside of that romantic stuff, that intelligent stuff, and that inside of religion, and it just sort of lines up. They become knowledgeable and caring and professional, and you can just look at the two, the home economists and the feminists, and you can just see a blatant difference. Those gals are the ones that are worth their weight in gold. If I had done my job with our stereotypical, what turned out to be I call the Marxist theology degree, it was one of those stereotypical do-gooder degrees, and we'll leave that for a while. I would have, and I had done my job, I would have taken a step back, grabbed my three-cornered hat, pipe and drum, go downtown, throw those judges out of there, and replace them with, instead of taking over the place and getting a Cuban hat and cigar, you would find those poor judges, lawyers that defended the poor and the oppressed, that whether they were the prosecutor or the defense attorney, you stick them in there. You go back to what amounts to natural law and home economics, and then you would walk over heading for the university. And in between, it's a very short mile, it's a short walk between courthouses and university. And you would stop at the city planning department, throw those scoundrels out of there, the ones that are building slums, and you would go and grab those gals, the last of the home economists, the last of the normal, well-adjusted gals, as best as human beings can, and you grab them by the hand, you turn around, you march them over to the city planning department, and there's a guy and there's a gal, and they make up the city planning part. There's an infusion. The guy would say things such as, okay, this is how much water we have. We need this to plant cotton and oranges around here. And then he would turn and say, okay, how do you want your city built? And it would be those gals. If those gals had to say, we'll have stereotypical houses over here and horse trails here and there. This is Tucson. And if they had their way, then this city would look completely different. They lost. We'll go back to them. We'll put a great deal of emphasis on them. Why? Well, because some guy died and came back and rose on the third day. And so it's going to be up to you. If you're listening to this and you're a gal and it's about 7 o'clock in London, or you live in Tollsbury or some such place, and you turn around and you say, okay, this is ridiculous. I'm a secretary at the plumbing supply shop, and this is my income, and I have to work more than one job just to try and come up with money for daycare so that somebody else can raise my child. I take him home and put him to bed and get him up, and he doesn't even know who I am. You got to start speaking up. And if you're a gal and you have a couple of teenage characters, you know darn well that the guy is going to try and grow up so fast and end up in prison, which is a very common thing now. And the gal doesn't, she's going to try and grow up too fast, and they're not going to stand a chance. If you speak up, then we can do something about it. What's wrong? What do you do about it, and how do you do it? What's wrong? They threw out God and country. They threw out saying these thoughts that have to do with fear, sex. They threw out straightening up your emotions, willing the good of another person, and doing it because Christ rose on the third day. And they threw out being a good wife and mother, being a good husband and father, and then they threw out home economics. What do you do? They threw it out uh, by unhinging that star in the sky, Christ, holding absolutes. What do you do about it? Well, instead of the court saying there is no God, you replace them with the court saying there's only God, the Apostles' Creed. And then you turn around and you head out from there. Once you do that, society is made up of our people. You want to be a citizen, you got to straighten up, bub. And then home economics. And now you can get started in a very big way. It's only right about now, guys like Donald Trump would be in his glory, wouldn't he? And the same with some of those guys in Great Britain and Canada. Well, we're trying to publicize our group to try and get people to start chiming in and saying, okay, this is what I make, this is enough. Before we go, I better point out that from the guy's point of view, for a guy to get a job and make enough money to support a wife and child, he's a man. If you're driving a forklift in a warehouse in London or Los Angeles, and you don't make enough money to support a wife and child, you don't even come close. If you didn't realize that yourself already, there are other words than being a man. A peon is one of them. Some begin with N, some begin with P, and that's just the way it is. So it's up to you to speak up. By the way, we need to know how much money you make, and we'll compare that with how much is the cost to get into a house, our kind of house, one that's designed appropriately, and how much does it cost to raise the children and to get health care. And that includes recreational budget for the gal and the guy as well. And just so it's said, you don't really ask how much money you make. Rather, you ask, okay, in the end, how many hours will I have to work? And you work to lower those hours. The same people, those are working a job is one of the jobs that produces things. And in this world, the person who does the producing does the consuming. If you're listening to this in Great Britain, one of those overly bright characters named Adam Smith figured out that if you specialize in labor, then you could produce more than you consume. And the Catholic Church came behind that and said, you got to practice virtues too. And okay. And with that bet, you can start to come up with recreational time and all these good things that happen. So you have a job, you have to hear this, and you have to start publicizing it. You have to there's a chat room right over there, and you have to get people that can start calling in. I've got 2 teenage girls. I'm a gal. I'm in terrible trouble. And this is how much money I make. This is what I need. This is what I need to have the family budget, and take it from there. So we'll see you on Facebook and Instagram and other places as soon as I can. And we have about 3 dozen anecdotes. The priest and the pimp. Forgive me for getting too much, but I just heard somebody saying how everybody's scrambling to go back and look at Aristotle and those sorts of characters. And without being one of those guys, when the person you're listening to got out of school, and I knew there was something horribly wrong with all of this, and I started going back. I even went and enrolled in some of the physics classes at the University of Arizona. I learned some things. The main thing was that the physics professors didn't have any emotional training, and it's a story. But the point is, I spent a lot of time trying to go back and ending up in scholastic philosophy. And there are things that what it amounts to is a Catholic. You sit there and tell yourself, I put the Pope in charge. And the minute I put the Pope in charge, I realize that I'm in charge. And if somebody walks up to you and says, oh, you're a communist, it's for the people, or a fascist, excuse me, they end up the same thing. Picture American slavery. You end up in the slave quarters and they end up in the big house. And there's this sense of original sin. And if you're going to do that, be sure and have, excuse me, have those very what seem like, well, old worldly phrases and turn it into economics. Home economics is just scholastic philosophy. Being normal and well adjusted is an outside imposed thing, and it's as opposed to the diagnostic and statistical manual. They changed the manual about the shop manual of how to be a nutso in the 1970s. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. They really didn't have everything polished to begin with, but that's when they threw out that's when they decided to say that homosexuality was no longer a mental illness. And the bum's rush there was that they threw out the idea of being normal and well adjusted, and because that's not a natural thing. And they threw out the idea of willing the good of another person. And they threw out Christ, that emotion. There's a very definite emotion. Those three things that make up that one thing, they threw it out. And then you realize it's hustled. With everything else, they unhinge things and just let it go for a generation, and things will get worse and worse. People will evolve. People will sort of fall apart. So will societies. And there's actually a group above all this. That's exactly what you do. Society will collapse, come in, take over, and do it again. I drifted a bit, but you had to get that out. What you do, you go back to being Catholic. I'm a Yank. Wherever I am. I'm a try to be normal, well-adjusted Joe, and I'm not going to rent property to anybody. I'm not going to rent property from anybody. I do the producing. I do the consuming. I'll be the father, and we'll get the next generation of children raised. And it has to start with you and the gal. You have to start saying, okay, I can't do this anymore. This is ridiculous. This is how much money I need to make ends meet. And we can do something about it right then and there. Well, hopefully on Saturdays and Mondays at 11 o'clock Los Angeles time, 2 o'clock New York time, and 7 o'clock in the evening in Great Britain. And then on Sundays at 8 o'clock Los Angeles and about 4 in Great Britain. We'll try and come on the air and try and talk you into starting to call in. I have a problem, though. I do so much babysitting at the moment with a couple of toddlers, or mainly one, and I certainly don't mind babysitting. It's the reasons I mind. It's the reasons that I mind. They just can't afford it. They can't afford the $700 or $800 a month it costs, and they'll just be plunged into poverty. They'll end up sitting in the street. So will you, if something isn't done right now. With Trump being elected, there's an opportunity. He's just what you need at the right time, but you have to be careful because if you have to go behind Donald Trump's back and straighten things out to begin with. Please let me ramble just a little bit farther. You'll notice when it comes to immigration here in the United States, they've got to there's a fundamental mistake, and they've got to take a step back, arrange things back along the lines of the classic battle of good and evil, and put those people who are illegal aliens that came up here to be an American Yank, that gal that's the home economist and that guy who's an American Yank, the guy probably would have voted for Trump if he could vote. And you have to grab them and pull them over here. And all those other people, which are millions, you got to lay down the law, and you have to be exceptionally ruthless. And that includes a lot of people in government here in Tucson, where this is being filmed. There's a whole group of Mexicans that belong to groups like in government. They're the ones that caused all this. We're changing the demographics, they used to say for decades ago. Why do we even need a two-party system? Says one of the county commissioners on the county board of supervisors, and they were quite successful at it. And what was their shtick? To hustle. And so you have to take a step back, and you have to get the good guys on one side and the bad guys on the other, the priest on one side and the pimp on the other. And then you have to be excessively aggressive. I'm sure no one will mind in Mexico, since this is here in Tucson, no one will mind in Mexico taking that silly fence and pushing it 50 miles south. If you want to be fair, when Donald Trump says things like, really talking about something else, when he said things like, well, Mexico can become a territory of the United States. Well, wait a minute, Mexico can become a territory of the United States. Why don't they dissolve that government, adopt the American dollar, adopt the family as a basic economic unit? And people, the average middle class, well, they would skyrocket, their standard of living would skyrocket. And so when you talk about that stuff, be fair, period. Be fair. I can tell you why they don't. And that's because there was a revolution in the 1920s in Mexico. The communists just beat the daylights out of the Catholics. They took over the place. There's a small group of exceptionally wealthy people, a huge gap, and then a huge group of peasantry, the standard Marxist stuff. And if you're arrested, you have to prove your innocence rather the other way around. A Catholic bishop a few years ago got arrested because he criticized the government. You can't criticize it. Evidently, there's quite a feminist took over the place and is the president now. And you're just going to have to, they could dissolve all that. They could get out of there and they won't. So maybe if you're listening to this and you're a Spanish gal or a Mexican gal and you're an American Yank, you speak up as well. You get on the same side as the gal from Great Britain and the gal who from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and you start speaking up. If you do that, then we can do something about it. Well, thank you. I hope to see you here on this podcast next week on Saturday. And please look for the group on Facebook and Instagram, and then start gathering your gang together. If you're a guy, grab that 3-cornered hat and fife and drum and go to work.